One set of policy which is very mandatory is that you have to, the government has to do the data keeping, must and foremost, which they do of course in migration. For instance, like they made women the primary um, owners of the houses. So they were so the house was allotted in their names.
We provide significant humanitarian support to assist people displaced by disasters, right through to helping communities improve their livelihoods, especially for those significantly impacted by climate change and disasters.
The irony of this things that climate change is induced by the factories and the cars in high income societies in high income countries, and yet it's the poorest in the world that suffer.
Welcome to Front Seat to Climate Change. I'm your host, Mahin Azam Khan. Climate change is not just reshaping landscapes, it's reshaping lives. Across Pakistan, floods, droughts, heat waves, and water scarcity are forcing people to leave their homes, often with nowhere safe to go. Climate migration is no longer a future risk. It is a present reality. To understand what this looks like on the ground, we're joined by Maria Patel, founder of Displacement.com, who works closely with communities affected by climate-driven displacement across Pakistan. Let's begin. Hello, Maria. Thank you so much for joining us today. So when we talk about climate-induced migration in Pakistan, what does it actually look like on the ground? Who is being forced to move and from where?
So when we talk about climate migration, so there are two things which we need to understand. I think when we last spoke on the show, I talked about this previously as well, but I want to repeat myself here. So there's a difference between migration and displacement, and that's what I mentioned earlier as well. Displacement is basically the sudden onset. It's like there's an element of suddenness in it, which means flood, earthquake, little bit of heat wave, somewhat. These are the elements which make people if they are making people displaced, which making people move away from their locations, that's called displacement. It could be hurricane, typhoon, these are the elements. But even in heat waves, and even the cases, matters of heat waves, it's only an occasion of couple of days. After those days, you have time to think, okay, this weather is becoming unbearable. I mean, things are really getting everything accumulates, starts accumulating, and you start thinking that on these days when there's no economic activity at home, or how it's affecting our economic financials, personal finances. So then you decide to move to those areas where you can have sustainable income source. So that's migration. So there's the time which you get to plan makes it migration, and time in which you have to decide to where you are going, it's displacement. It has to be understood very clearly because the entire policy revolves around migration, which is there's no element of hurriedness, or you have to be on your toes when it comes to people's relocating. So that's what that's the understanding we need to develop first if we need to talk about migration, climate migration or climate displacement. For instance, in displacement, you need to have different set of policies. One set of policy which is very mandatory is that you have to, the government has to do the data keeping, must and foremost, which they do of course in migration. But in this case, the urgency develops more, because with that displacement, as it's basically at the heart of all the human rights issues. So with that displacement, what happens is everything exacerbated. Children's education becomes very secondary, tertiary actually in many cases. Their health becomes secondary. The first thing which becomes important is getting them shelter and food. So health should not be a secondary subject. Health should be at the heart of with displacement also health challenges occur. One of the health challenges which we have seen repeatedly is women who are pregnant, they do not have enough pregnancy kits or midwifery services in their areas where they have been relocated. So these are the things which has to be treated in a very different with a different mindset. Is what I always stress about.
And as you rightfully mentioned, that climate-induced migration in Pakistan is already, visible in everyday life, with specific communities that are being pushed out of, vulnerable regions by repeated environmental shocks. So after major disasters like the 2022 floods, how many people are actually able to, return home, and how many people they remain displaced long term?
I know about Sindh's data. I will talk about that. And Punjab's data is very skewed. It's very narrative driven and all of it. So I'm not sure. Why I'm saying I'm not saying since data is very transparent, but because international major players were a part of and relocation of those people who get displaced in Sindh in 2022 flood. What happened was the Sindh was the one of the most affected provinces, primarily affected provinces. Data is there. We know 24 million houses were completely or partially devastated in Sindh alone. 24 million means 2.4 million houses were partially or completely damaged, because of which people had to be evacuated. So those people were put into camps, and those camps were this time as compared to 2010 floods or 2012 floods in Sindh, as compared to those times, Sindh was much prepared and was ready to not let them be absorbed in the communities. So they realized that housing is one of the biggest issues, and that's where people's housing schemes shelter schemes started working on the ground. And this is the data which the 2.4 million is the data which they quote, out of which they have provided built now 1.4 million houses were completely damaged. So which means they had to rebuild all the whole, not rebuild, actually they had to build those 1.4 million houses. And then 1 million houses, approximately 1 million houses were those houses which were partially damaged, their roof collapsed, their wall collapsed, their bathroom is not functioning, things like that, or half of the house is damaged. So these houses were easy to rebuild. So from out of completely damaged houses, the rebuilding, so they say 600,000 houses have been completely built and been given, their rights have been given. It had a lot of teething issues as well, but give the credit where it's due. Sindh government really handled it nicely. It's not I have a very critical eye towards these things, and if I'm saying that I think they have done a great job. For instance, they made women the primary owners of the houses. So they were so the house was allotted in their names. So these were some of the good measures, women in terms of women empowerment, in terms of providing shelter, in terms of knowing who's responsible for the household, the running of the household. And this this did not came for out of uh, nowhere. It didn't come out of any. They saw things on the ground, and out one of the case studies which they share in the beginning, they were giving loans to the men of the house, whoever was coming. But what was happening was, in the first installment they were giving for the housing, the men was buying motorcycle from it, or livestock from it, that it is more important rather than starting building the shelter, because of which that money was going in somewhere else and not in the shelter. So then they realized that women are more responsible. They do it responsibly. So this is sorry, and so maybe this data is not necessary, or this answer is very lengthy. Maybe you can cut it, Lisa. But this is what I feel. That this displacement, this time in 2022 floods, That is, after the displacement, people have moved back to their homes, and there was a limited time for that. They were not completely absorbed by the urban centers as compared to the ones in 2010 floods or 2012 floods.
Yes, and unfortunately, this is becoming our reality now. So I think it's high time that we come up with comprehensive policies for all provinces. And like the examples that you mentioned for Sindh, I think, all provinces should follow suit because every year, I think we know that we will be faced, by floods. So it's really time that we come. It's high time we come up with concrete policies, especially for women, because women and children are the ones who are most impacted by, climate change. So is climate migration in Pakistan mainly internal, or are climate pressures also pushing people to cross borders?
So climate migration is mostly internal, but in heat wave events in urban centers are pushing people across borders. So they are like, making them feel like, okay, the educated class, the already urban middle class of in any city started thinking that how about like, if these are the circumstances, we can work anywhere, right? And it's better to like, have a better lifestyle and like, all the income generation possibilities, which in foreign income in foreign currency also like, gives a lot of like grabs the attention in a lot of ways. So I think in the urban centers, people are moving abroad. So they are not getting displaced; they are migrating abroad, and in from the rural centers, they are moving to the urban centers. So in when we look at the climate displacement, it is somewhat like upward move. There is an upward mobility, and already existing urban middle class is getting vanished. People have different aspirations, and of course, like all we know it. It's a cruel thing, maybe, but upward mobility is like also needs to be looked at in a very different or with a very different urban lens. And right now, since it's not that important, but I think yes, climate displacement or climate migration affects communities, and there is an internal displacement, but also the cross-border internal migration, but also cross-border migration as well.
As you rightfully said, that also understanding climate migration in Pakistan requires actually looking at whether people are moving within the country or, they're being pushed beyond its borders. What happens to people once they migrate, especially in cities like Karachi? Are urban centers prepared to absorb climate displaced populations?
No, of course not. We are never prepared. So we only know that cities can expand, but we work on cities expansion. We do not work on what city is going to absorb. By that, like I mean that city has a certain you know length and breadth, and with that there's the depth. Depth means like you have enough resources to absorb people. Resources primary resource means jobs and skill based jobs or like things like that. So we do not even talk about it. We do not even touch on those topics. It's not even like, in I think it's not even a part of our policy discourse that if people come here, and of course, like not everybody goes. We have seen it over the years that like, for instance, 100 people have migrated or just gotten displaced because of a climate event or because of like, climate, because of drought. Drought is an onset, slow onset. So people have decided to migrate to Karachi or like to other parts of the city of the country. Like for instance, somebody migrated to Satkar or somebody migrated to Hyderabad from like Tando Alayar or Tando Muhammad Khan or Tando Yunus or like the other areas of Sindh of like to they have decided to bigger cities, for instance. If they have decided to move to bigger cities, uh, are those cities does those cities like it's not just shelter they need, they also need like health education as well as jobs. So income generation is like very basic. So I don't think we have that in our uh, policy discourse at all. We do not even talk about it, and it needs urban studies. For instance, even in Islamabad, when we look at Islamabad, it is absorbing people from the landslides. People from in the floods, flash floods in the mountainous region and KP region. So they have started moving to Islamabad. These people have started moving to Islamabad. So Islamabad is ready to give housing to them, shelter to them, because it's still expanding, and still new roads are building. The tree which happened with Karachi, the same thing is happening with Islamabad right now. The entire infrastructure is is almost collapsing. Water scarcity of the city is growing. The underground water is going deep, it's reducing. It's if it was coming at 70 feet underneath, now it is 200 plus feet underneath, and in some areas it's 400 feet. You have to drill 400 feet to get the groundwater. So these are the things which we are which we have not thought about. And the water, the provision of water, all the resources, basically, we have not thought about, we have not been prepared for it, and it's not even a part of our policy discourse. That if communities move to urban centers, are urban centers prepared enough to absorb them? So yeah, that is not. Um, I think they think just the land mass is enough. It's not enough, I think.
Thank you so much for this brilliant explanation. I think if I had to sum it up in one line, it would be that for many climate migrants, the journey ends in major cities where the challenges of settlement and survival, it becomes the next test for them. Which groups do you think are most vulnerable during climate-induced displacement, and how are women and children affected differently?
Climate affects women in a way, children and women in a very different way, but also older people. So our elderlies are also very affected. For instance, if I was talking about the flash floods in the KP area, if there's a flash flood in the KP area, it's a mountainous region. You cannot move people. There are no roads there, and whatever roads they have, they are getting washed away by the flood water. So now what? How will they be evacuated? We have seen these things in different scenarios. Like one of the villages in the mountainous areas are not accessible, and they are there's a food crisis there, and people are hiking for hours and hours to get the rescue relief, which we have just seen in 2025 floods in Pakistan. We had just witnessed that. And similarly, women, we do not have enough complete data of how many women are pregnant in that area, and what which trimester they are in, what kind of facility they need right now. If they are in their last trimester, so how should we evacuate them? How should we evacuate them? We do not have enough data for these. So I think women and elderlies are very marginalized. Also, children, they need to have, they need to be prepared. They should be lessons, DRR lessons in school, disaster risk reduction lessons in schools. It should be a part of our curriculum. Children should be prepared, and they should help, because whatever children learn in school, they also bring it to home, and they also share it with their mothers. So that becomes an easier way. It's a two-way learning process. So which can help these marginalized communities to and then secondly, if you are a religious minority in this country, then you are also exempted from donations, some certain donations, because somehow in our country zakat is one of the biggest form of donations. So whenever we give a call For donations, we say like, zakat's eligible. Now, but now zakat is not eligible to this religious minority group. So though they are also like, that's really a challenge here. So there should be I believe that there should be a different policy, and when we are making policies, we should be talking differently about religious minority groups, women, elderlies, and children. That how can we like, prepare them for with the first aid, or like, how can we prepare them for such disasters, evacuation, like, what to look for, situational awareness. These are the things which we need to like, give them, make them hands-on, give them hands-on training. And especially like, if a woman is pregnant, they usually like, access midwives, or like, BHUs, or DHUs, district head of units, or like, so if they are going to those areas, to those centers, or to those units, or they are like, somebody is approaching them, they should also be like, telling them that if some disaster is happening in your area and you have to run, so then how you should be prepared for that. So like, it can easily be tackled. It doesn't need a lot of work, but it just needs like, somebody to sit and implement it. So yeah, these are the vulnerable groups, and there is a solution for it, which we can like, easily implement.
I think definitely, and we also need more representation from each of these groups when it comes to policy matters, because climate-induced displacement does not affect everyone equally. Because, like you mentioned, that certain groups they face far greater risks than others. So, is Pakistan treating climate migration as a temporary emergency or a long-term reality? And what urgently needs to change in planning and policy?
Basically, when it comes to policy shift or policy, so in 2022 floods, we all remember like, what happened, because 2010 is like, right, like, way behind in our memories. We do not even remember. Many people were like, many people were really kids at that time, so they do not have any recollection of it. So I think uh, 2022 floods, what it taught us is that we need better preparedness. And since we are a part of the Kyoto Protocol, we signed that, which means that risk reduction should be at the heart of our policy. So, like, we are somewhat prepared, but we are somewhat not prepared. Like, for instance, we are not prepared for the urban challenges. In 2025 floods, what we have seen from 2022 floods situation, what we have seen was that people got displaced, governments stepped in, all like provincial governments stepped in. They have like, moved them to like, safer patches, but there is no follow up on have they gotten back? How many have have gotten back? For how many days they were there, like, in those shelters? For how many days ration was provided to them? We do not have any. And like, what happened to children? We do not have a comprehensive data on that. And governments have a way to like, also
Yeah.
um, like, shadow it. And media also just forgets about these things, because there's like, we have a manic news cycle, and it's like really politics like, takes a precedent, and climate related issues like, take a back seat. And displacement is one of the biggest climate related issues. It's not just like, it's not, it cannot be like if we talk about climate change, I think displacement should be at the heart, at the center of the climate change. And the policy work should be extensive, and like, should be jotted down in minute details. And all experts from like, all think tanks, all experts should sit together and like advise the government on that. So this is what I believe.
Definitely, I think how Pakistan responds to climate migration will depend on whether, it's seen as a short-term crisis or a permanent feature of the country's future. Thank you so much, Maria, as always, for your brilliant insights.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Climate migration in Pakistan isn't an isolated event. It's layered, ongoing, and deeply unequal. But this isn't just a national issue. Across South Asia, climate-driven movement is accelerating, often without legal recognition or long-term planning. To understand how this fits into the regional and global picture, we'll be joined next by International Organization of Migration. Stay with us. South Asia is one of the world's most climate vulnerable regions. Rising temperatures, erratic monsoons, floods, droughts, and sea level rise are affecting livelihoods across borders. According to the World Bank, climate change could force over 216 million people globally to migrate internally by 2050, with South Asia among the hardest hit regions. So, how do international organizations define climate migration, and how prepared are governments to respond? Joining us now is Chris Richter, a regional thematic specialist, climate action and mobility from the International Organization for Migration.
Hello, Chris. Thank you so much for joining us today. So, how do you define climate migration and how prevalent is it in South Asia?
Yeah, well, first of all, thank you very much for having me and for the question. So, this definitional question is an interesting one, and I guess the first thing you need to know about this is that there's no internationally agreed definition or terminology to describe the situation of people who move due to climate and environmental factors. And in fact, if you sort of read the academic literature or you listen to some of the public discussions on this topic, or if you do a search on the internet, you'll come across a whole range of different terms and phrases used by different organizations and individuals. But none of these have any sort of legal value, and they're used primarily for advocacy purposes. Now, for its part, IOM has also developed its own sort of working definition of environmental migration, which is it's also non-normative. It doesn't serve any legal purpose, but it's really an attempt to try and present and capture the complexity of this issue and to bring attention to it a little bit more. So this concept of environmental migration is very broad, and it essentially covers people who, because of sudden or progressive changes in the environment, are forced to leave their places of habitual residence or choose to do so either temporarily or permanently and within or outside their country of origin. So it covers both forced and voluntary movements, temporary or permanent movements, and domestic or international movements as well. And it also covers a wide variety of different environmental hazards, including things like, earthquakes and tsunamis, or even big infrastructure projects that might have an environmental impact, as well as climatic issues like sea level rise, storms and floods, or changing rainfall patterns, and so on. And so climate migration is sort of a narrower concept that focuses just on those climatic drivers. So that's, sort of the IOM perspective. But at the global level, through, the processes related to the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, the term climate mobility has also gained some prominence in a lot of those sorts of discussions. And that's sort of an umbrella term which is used to describe different forms of movement that can occur in the context of climate and environmental change, including migration, displacement, and planned relocation. And so this is actually an important point, I think, for your viewers to remember that when we talk about environmental migration or climate migration or climate mobility, we're actually talking about a number of different forms of mobility, each with their own challenges. Now, in terms of how prevalent it is, I think it's important to note that Asia and the Pacific as a whole is, one of the regions that is most vulnerable to climate change impacts. And it's also one of the regions that has experienced significant instances of climate mobility across the board. So many countries across the region, both developed and developing, have been impacted. And this is not a future issue. It's something that is happening today and will continue into the future as well. So maybe just to put that in context, for example, between 2008 and around 2024, there were something in the order of 330 million disaster displacements across the region, and that was roughly 3/4 of the global total for that period. So Asia and the Pacific is significantly impacted. In South Asia specifically, there were approximately 9.2 million disaster displacements in 2024 alone. And that was the second highest figure for the region in more than a decade, actually, and was nearly 1/4 of the global total for that year as well. So countries like India, Bangladesh, Afghanistan, Pakistan, and Sri Lanka were the countries most impacted in the region in that order. But in global terms, India and Bangladesh were among the top 5 in 2024. But that can obviously vary from year to year. And in 2022, for example, Pakistan was actually the most impacted country due to the significant monsoon floods that occurred that year. Now, up to this point, I've just been talking about disaster displacement, but as I mentioned, there are other forms of mobility that are relevant to this discussion as well, such as planned relocation. And on that score, there have been at least 199 recorded cases of planned relocation across the Asia and the Pacific as a whole, but that's likely to be a significant undercount as well. And several countries in South Asia, including India, Maldives, Pakistan, Nepal, Sri Lanka, and Bangladesh, all have experience in this. So it is quite significant across the board.
Of course, and I think understanding the scale and the definition of climate migration, makes it more possible to explore the factors that, drive people to move. And as you've mentioned as well, that, Pakistan is one of the countries that was actually impacted a lot by climate change. And because we hail from Pakistan as well, unfortunately, climate change has become our reality. And we know that next year, these rates are just going to increase. So what are the main drivers that are forcing people to migrate due to climate-related events?
Yeah, so the answer to this sort of depends a little bit on which type of movement we're talking about. If we're looking at disaster displacements, for example, storms and floods are the hazards that, far and away produce the largest instances of displacement. If we're talking about planned relocation, the picture is a little bit more mixed, actually. In the Pacific, for example, the cases of planned relocation that have been identified there have primarily been driven by floods, but also by coastal erosion. In Asia, tsunamis have actually been the key driver, and sort of presumably that's related to the 2006 tsunami that affected a number of countries in South and Southeast Asia, followed by floods and storms after that. But one point I want to highlight here, though, is that although I've given you some sort of specific answers on the hazards that have primarily driven displacement and planned relocation across the region, it's actually not so straightforward to pinpoint specific drivers. And in fact, climate and environmental factors will rarely, if ever, be the singular factor that determines whether or not someone stays or goes. And it's actually much more likely that climate and environmental factors will interact with other, socioeconomic drivers as well as individual circumstances to produce some sort of mobility outcome, whether that's being forced to move or choosing to move, or being forced to stay or choosing to stay. And so we often talk about climate change and environmental stress being risk multipliers, for example, in that they amplify existing vulnerabilities, particularly where things like poverty or weak governance and other sorts of challenges like that are significant. So it's a very complex bag, and it's quite difficult to pinpoint specific drivers in specific cases.
Thank you so much for this explanation. I think once these drivers are identified, it sort of becomes important to examine how institutions and governments respond to such displacement, especially, in countries that are based in South Asia. How do governments, do you think, in the region respond to climate-induced displacement?
Yeah, so I mean, I might talk about this starting a little bit from the global level and then narrowing down to South Asia. But as a general proposition, I think there's been growing interest and awareness from governments on this issue of climate mobility, which has been driven in large part by, the greater availability of evidence and research highlighting the impacts and the sort of data that I just outlined. And of course, also the direct impacts that are being felt across a lot of these countries as well. And at the global level, this has really prompted increasing attention to climate mobility, in particular in the context of, the UNFCCC and the annual Conference of the Parties, the COP meetings associated with that. And there have been a number of key decision points and milestones in those processes that have included elements related to climate mobility. So these include the Cancun Adaptation Framework, which was adopted at COP16 back in 2010. That was sort of the first time these issues really started to, I guess, be incorporated into those sorts of international discussions. We have the Warsaw International Mechanism on Loss and Damage, which is a body that sits under the UNFCCC framework, and under which there's also a dedicated task force on displacement. And that has developed a set of recommendations for governments and other partners to implement. And more recently, in the processes around, the global goal on adaptation, there are discussions on indicators relating to human mobility, and a new fund for responding to loss and damage is also specifically mandated to address climate mobility in its funding portfolio. So we're sort of seeing, I guess, the gradual development at the global level of different mechanisms and frameworks to address climate mobility challenges. And governments are also doing this at the regional level as well. So in 2022, for example, governments in the Eastern Horn of Africa adopted what is known as the Kampala Ministerial Declaration on Migration, Environment and Climate Change. And that sort of addresses the intersection of migration, environment and climate change, and it sort of commits states to strengthen data, legislation and coordination, and to embed human mobility issues into their adaptation and development planning. And it's since been expanded across the African continent as well. Pacific governments, meanwhile, have also come together regionally to develop a Pacific regional framework on climate mobility, which promotes common action and common responses to this topic. And across the Americas, climate mobility policy approaches have also evolved through, the region's legal and institutional architecture. So the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights, for example, has adopted a resolution on human mobility and climate change. And the Inter-American Court has also put out an advisory opinion that sort of reaffirms states' obligations to prevent displacement and protect people affected by climate impacts and environmental degradation. So these collective responses have really enabled significant progress, I'd say, and shown a great deal of potential for action. And we're also seeing this sort of action at the national level as well. So coming specifically to this region in South Asia, Bangladesh has been quite keen to address climate mobility in different policy instruments it has developed. And IOM has been working with the government of Sri Lanka to develop a national roadmap on climate mobility. In Nepal, we've seen the Established Declaration, which cover these issues. And in Pakistan as well, we've sort of provided some support to the government to integrate human mobility issues in the discussions around its national adaptation plan and nationally determined contribution under the Paris Agreement. And so these are all quite positive advancements, but really, I'd say there's still a lot of work to be done in this area to improve overall governance in the region in particular.
Of course, and I think an assessment of these responses naturally, draws attention to the adequacy of existing legal and policy frameworks, especially in countries like South Asia. What legal or policy gaps do you think exist for climate migrants, given that they're not formally recognized, under international law?
Yeah. So, I mean, your question sort of touches a little bit on a long-standing debate in different academic and political circles about whether or not we need some sort of international treaty to address the movement of people displaced by climate change. And we can talk a bit more about that if you want, but to me, the biggest gaps are actually around implementing the frameworks that have been developed, first of all, but then also expanding governance in countries and regions where there hasn't been as much progress to date. So South Asia, for example, is a place where the issue is still much more nascent compared to other regions, even though, there are these emerging examples that I pointed to at the national level. But on the whole, there are still a number of gaps, I would say, and even in countries where there has been some progress, there's still, in some cases, a lack of concrete measures, for example, to respond in a practical way. And at the same time, we haven't seen as much movement towards developing a common regional response in South Asia either, though, we hope this is something that, we can progressively work towards over the coming years. Now, the insights that we as IOM have gathered from our work in the region has sort of highlighted a number of potential reasons why progress in South Asia and Southeast Asia too, I should say, hasn't advanced as much so far, including, for example, a lack of context-specific and government-owned evidence and data on the specific impacts. Now, I highlighted earlier that there is sort of increasing knowledge around this topic, but that's sort of at the aggregate level, and we still need to drill down into what that means in particular countries, but also particular regions in particular countries, because it can be different from, the north of the country compared to the south, for example. And so having that sort of granularity is important. It's something that's still a little bit lacking currently. There are also, I would say, capacity challenges, both from the community perspective, but also in governments as well, especially given that this issue affects so many areas of public policy, and it's easy for this topic to sort of fall between different ministries, right? And financing is also a key barrier, as many of the sort of global climate funds haven't provided specific financing to address climate mobility issues. Although, as I mentioned, the new fund for responding to loss and damage does, cover this issue, so that may help to some extent. So these are some of the gaps that we see, but these are also at the same time areas where, collaboration and support from the international community, I think, can provide a lot of the answers to these sorts of challenges.
I think recognizing these gaps really highlights the importance, like you just mentioned, of collaboration and of learning from operational and field level experiences. Are there examples of best practices or interventions by IOM or any other organizations in supporting climate migrants?
Yeah, so IOM has been working in this field since at least the early 1990s, when we started to do some of the first research on the links between migration, the environment, and climate change. We're also the first international organization to establish dedicated teams to look at these sorts of issues. So we do have a long history in this field, and I don't think it's sort of would be overstating things to say that IOM has been somewhat of a pioneer in this area. And the types of interventions that we've implemented range from supporting improved governance of climate mobility by helping them to develop dedicated national and regional policy instruments. We've looked at building the capacity of governments and communities as well to prepare for and respond to disasters through support, for example, to improved early warning systems and education for disaster management authorities and even in schools, for example. We provide significant humanitarian support to assist people displaced by disasters, right through to helping communities improve their livelihoods, especially for those significantly impacted by climate change and disasters. And our experience in this area has shown that this sort of broad-based approach is really what is required. And that, of course, involves collaboration with a whole range of other international and national partners who bring different perspectives and capacities to these sorts of issues. We've had a really terrific multi-stakeholder program in the Pacific, for example, that has involved other UN and non-UN partners and has been highlighted as sort of a successful example of collaboration. So, that sort of ongoing engagement with different stakeholders and coming at it from a broad perspective is, I guess, sort of thinking of best practices, what we're really looking at.
Brilliant. I think more power to IOM for supporting such practices, and collaboration is the key. Now, climate migration is a concept that is also connected to wider social and structural issues. How does climate migration intersect with issues like gender, poverty, and urban planning in affected areas?
Yeah, so as you say, I mean, these climate and environmental issues really do interact with a host of other socioeconomic, political, and demographic factors to influence movement and its outcomes. And that's true both before, during, and after movement as well. And so if we break that down to look at specific issues, for example, the gender dimension, what we see is that women and girls face heightened risks during displacement, for example. They face increased exposure to gender-based violence, in particular in the aftermath of disasters, loss of livelihoods, and barriers to accessing health and education. Gender roles also often dictate who migrates and who stays behind, and can influence household resilience and sort of adaptation strategies because of that. And it's common, in a lot of countries, for example, to send young working age males to work overseas to compensate for lost incomes or livelihoods back home. But that, of course, has implications for the family members who stay behind, and women and girls in particular who stay behind. But of course, that also has implications for those young men as well who travel overseas and who may experience increased exposure to environmental hazards in their country of destination. We've seen a lot, for example, about the situation of migrant workers, in particular from South Asia, who travel to the Middle East and who experience working conditions that expose them to extreme heat and humidity, for example, which of course produces significant health risks. So the key issue really is that people can experience the impacts of climate and environmental change differently depending on their individual circumstances and characteristics. And so policies have to recognize these sorts of differences and integrate gender-sensitive approaches to ensure protection and empowerment in climate mobility responses. If we look at sort of poverty and inequality-related issues, we know as well that climate shocks disproportionately affect low-income households, and it can reduce their adaptive capacity and force migration as a last resort. But migration can also be sort of a coping mechanism in that context. While remittances from people overseas can help, displaced families often also face precarious employment and housing conditions. So sort of two sides of one coin. And addressing, poverty in that context is also essential for reducing forced migration and enabling, more voluntary forms of movement, for example. If we're looking at the urban dimension, climate mobility can, of course, accelerate urban growth, often in informal settlements with inadequate infrastructure and services and things like that. Poorly planned urbanization, meanwhile, can also increase exposure to hazards, whether it's floods or heat waves and so on, and constrain local governance. And so it's important to integrate all of these different dimensions into urban planning, through housing policies, resilient infrastructure, and social protection as well. But as we can see, there's a lot of different dimensions to this, which is why when I mentioned before that those sorts of broad-based approaches are important, because we have to cover off on the linkages with these different dimensions, whether it's gender or poverty or urbanization and so on.
So taken together, these dimensions underscore the need to, consider future-oriented strategies. So looking forward, what measures should be prioritized to address the growing challenges of climate migration?
Yeah, so I mean, I think the overarching policy should be really to improve the governance of climate mobility across the region. Now, what does that mean? I mean, that could include, for example, establishing clear legal and policy frameworks that recognize and respond to the mobility dimensions of climate and environmental change. It would involve strengthening institutional coordination across different sectors, whether we're talking about climate change or environment or disaster management, labor, housing, social protection, and so on, but also between national and local authorities. And, importantly, it would also involve, I think, providing support to the communities most affected by these issues, whether that's communities who are vulnerable to climate change impacts or who have already been displaced or on the move or otherwise need to be protected. So in terms of specific measures that government should prioritize, there are sort of three main areas that they should consider. And the first is really to provide solutions for people to stay where they are and to avoid displacement where possible. And this is where, interventions focused on climate change adaptation and disaster risk reduction are critical. The second would be to provide solutions for people already on the move, in particular to provide assistance to people who have been displaced, but also to provide support to existing migrant workers overseas who might be impacted by environmental hazards. And the third area would be to provide solutions for people to move if that's something that they want to do, right? So, this could include supporting planned relocation or even establishing or leveraging labor migration channels to help people to live and work overseas if needed. And these are all areas in which IOM is scaling up its support to governments in South Asia in particular. In the past few months, for example, we've initiated a sub-regional program focusing one on South Asia, one on Southeast Asia, that will provide support to that overall priority of improving governance in the region. And these programs are supported by the European Union. So we have strong institutional partners in addition to the governments in the region, of course. And that's something that we're hoping to progress over the next few years in particular.
Thank you so much for your brilliant insights, Chris. Thank you.
Climate migration is growing faster than legal frameworks and policy responses can keep up. While organizations like IOM work on adaptation and protection, millions remain in a gray zone, displaced, but not formally recognized. Which brings us to a critical question. What rights do climate displaced people actually have under international law? We explore that next with a legal expert. Stay with us. Despite the scale of climate displacement, international law still struggles to name it. People fleeing floods, droughts, or rising seas are not legally recognized as refugees under the 1951 Refugee Convention, which only covers persecution based on race, religion, nationality, political opinion, or social group. So where does that leave climate displaced people? Joining us is Oves Anwar, a lawyer specializing in international law and displacement.
Hello, Wes. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you for having me.
So why is climate-induced migration still not recognized as a legal category under international law, despite millions being displaced by climate disasters?
Well, I mean, there are a number of factors. Some are political, some are just the nature of international law. One of the particular, unique features of international law is that it is not a law that is imposed on its constituent constituent elements, which are the states, right? So this is a voluntary acceptance. States voluntarily accept legal obligations. And what that really means is that states negotiate together and they come up with the least common denominator that everyone, or generally the largest group of states, accepts and agrees to. So international law isn't the most ideal version of the law. It's just something that is acceptable to most individuals or most states, sorry. And in that regard, when it comes to climate change, there are many states who prefer the alternative to hard law, which is soft law, which is non-binding but voluntary agreements on issues related to climate change. The other issue is that when we talk about migration, that is a huge burden on a lot of states, right? And at least states feel that this would become a huge burden. So if they started to give rights that way, they're afraid that this would be a much greater um, burden on their taxpayer, on the health system, on how civilian structures are set up in these countries. Another problem that we see here is that you have a very, a robust system known as refugee law, where people who are escaping, well-founded fear of persecution based on religion or ethnicity or a range of factors. However, climate-induced migration is not one of those factors, right? And it's usually because refugee law was made with man-made disasters or man-made atrocities in mind, not really natural calamities or the slow creep that climate-related disasters can have. And so these are some of the issues that we face, and that's why we don't really have a category there, and that's the problem.
I think you summed it up very nicely when you said that, they're mostly based on man-made atrocities, refugees. And they're not really, we don't have enough binding laws that, refugees can be based out of, natural calamities as well. And this is actually now the future that we're looking at, especially in countries like Pakistan, because every year we're faced by floods, heat waves, and, these things are displacing millions. So you know that South Asia is among the most climate vulnerable regions with floods, heat waves, sea level rise. So where do people displaced by, climate impacts legally stand today?
So this is a very troubling question. Again, because we don't have a well-recognized legal category of climate-induced migrants or people who are suffering from natural disasters, what they can do. It's domestic governments really, and it's their onus. The onus is really on them to be able to cater for these things. Now, the problem that we see in South Asia is that this is an impoverished region, right? These are all developing countries, some who are coming out of long periods of conflict. Look at Afghanistan. They're places where revolutions have taken place, Sri Lanka and Bangladesh, right? So governance systems may not be the best. And we've seen a lot of the climate disasters that have taken place, whether it was the tsunami in Sri Lanka or the flooding in Bangladesh or the flooding in Pakistan, for example. These become very serious issues. And other than the aid, the little bit of aid that flows in or from brotherly nations or from the rest of the world, there isn't a legal mechanism internationally to protect these individuals. We certainly have domestic mechanisms. We have disaster management authorities at the provincial level, the national level, and it goes down all the way. And Pakistan has built a very robust mechanism in this regard. But when it comes to legal protections, unfortunately, at the international level, there's very little that can help South Asians.
Yeah, that's actually true. Just building up on this, if someone is forced to cross a border because their land is no longer livable due to climate change, could you please tell us that what sort of protection, if any, do they have under, existing international laws?
So again, when somebody turns up at your border, there is generally an international law obligation on the state of non-refoulement. And non-refoulement is the essence of refugee law. That if a person shows up at your border having a well-founded fear of persecution with regards to things like they're being persecuted because of their race, their religion, their nationality, political opinion, or membership of some group, on those bases, you are bound to give them protection, at least not return them to that place where they receive that persecution. Now, what states do is that these are generally asylum seekers. So they come in, they seek asylum at the state. The state then assesses whether they're deserving of this protection, of that state's protection. And they can reject if they don't feel that the fear of persecution was genuine. Or what they can alternatively do is that they can grant this where these situations are genuine. And we see this around the world, even in Pakistan. This is a mechanism that works. We have the UNHCR that functions. The problem, again, as mentioned earlier, is that climate-induced migrants, people who are escaping, very tough conditions, whether those are natural disasters or something along those lines, or whether it's something slow that famine drought has come in. It's caused famine in a region. People are escaping that. Rains haven't come in for years, and people are trying to escape that. There is no category, and there's certainly no protection under refugee law for that at the moment. What we have seen is that the Human Rights Council, which is the UN body, has adjudicated under its complaint acceptance mechanism in a case regarding New Zealand, where they for the first time recognized that this could become a category that deserves protection. In the particular case, the protection was denied because of the facts, but it was recognized at least for the first time. So what we're really looking at right now is a movement that is going to be built to change the law and really work towards that. But at the same time, we also have to look at the environment in which international law. The last 2 years, if we've seen, international law has taken a beating, very significant erosion of some of the fundamental elements of international law. Having the current administration, the Trump administration, really, I think he said the other day that I don't need international law, right? So those are, if you have to negotiate a treaty or something binding to protect people in this type of environment, it becomes very difficult. And so that's really what the concern is. But we have hope for the future.
Absolutely, I think with where we're heading right now, it's very important to protect your own domestic rights. It's very important to see what the state is doing within your own country, right? So is the lack of recognition for climate-induced migrants, do you think, is a legal limitation, or it's a political choices by the states that are trying to avoid responsibility?
So I think states within their borders are adequately dealing with a lot of these issues. One is it becomes such a serious humanitarian issue that they can't ignore it. At one point, a third of our country, Pakistan, was underwater, and we're not a small country. The province of Sindh was badly affected by the flooding, and so it's not something that states can really hide or shy away from. And in Pakistan, I'm glad that we have mechanisms that involve civilian authorities, military authorities that go in and are able to rescue a lot of people. At the same time, we are, underdeveloped countries, and we have to look at, how can we better protect these individuals? And certainly, climate change is one of those cross-cutting factors that affects human rights across the board, right? We also know that climate change has an inordinate impact on women and girls, more so than men and boys. And so that is something that needs to be taken care of. When people are displaced, when they are put in, say, camps where almost like refugee camps. So internally displaced individuals need to be given the types of protections that they look at, and their human rights need to be protected. And that's something that we can certainly domestically expand on, because there's no limitation. Other than the politics behind it, we can legislate on protections for climate-induced migrants or people who are displaced due to these calamities, and we can have a range of protections in that regard, and certainly compensation, because these are people who've lost everything. They've lost their homes, they've lost their livelihoods, their farms, their cattle, a lot of those things. And it's not like they came from very affluent backgrounds in any case, right? These are poor people who are most affected by this. And so we need to look at the overall framework. We need to find mechanisms which can enhance these things, because again, and this is just the last word on this, but this is a recurring theme in Pakistan. This is a recurring issue in Pakistan. This isn't the end of floods. We are going to see these time and again. And so it becomes something that we need to find lasting, durable, sustainable means of dealing with, whether those are legally backed, or whether those are, private sector coming in, whether it is individuals providing charity and aid. It's really a whole of state, whole of society, whole of community effort to tackle these things.
The law, as it stands, leaves millions displaced by climate change without clear protection. But legal recognition alone isn't enough. The real question is whether the world is willing to act before displacement turns into a permanent crisis. We'll close by looking ahead. What needs to change urgently and collectively? Climate migration is not a future scenario. It's already shaping cities, borders, and societies. According to UNHCR, weather-related disasters displace an average of 21.5 million people every year, a figure expected to rise as climate impacts intensify. So what does a just and realistic response look like? We're continuing our conversation with Oves,
recurring is actually the perfect word to be used for this situation, domestically and internationally. It is indeed a recurring theme in Pakistan, and I think it's also a recurring theme in the international world as well. We're having loads of debates about the global south and global north, and the responsibilities that the global north has towards the global south. And my next question is sort of based on that who bears responsibility for climate displacement? The countries that are experiencing migration, or the high emitting countries driving, climate change?
So again, this is the irony of this things that climate change is induced by the factories and the cars in high income societies and high income countries, and yet it's the poorest in the world that suffer from this. So it's a cruel dispensation, if you will. Look, we're clear on where the if you want to call it the blame, but the responsibility lies. It is with states who have not only the resources, but who have contributed directly to this thing and continue to do so, right? And there isn't a race on to reduce emissions that one would expect when the situation is as dire as it is right now. With scientists saying that we are going to cross the limits of 2 degrees, 3 degrees, and that we're reaching a point of no return, where the melting ice caps and weather change patterns are taking place. So it's clear where the responsibility lies. The issue is, are they going to take responsibility? Are they going to accept responsibility? And with responsibility comes obligations. And the obligation is, put your money where your mouth is. How are you going to aid states who are suffering from, say, the type of glacial melt or the type of severe flooding that, say, Pakistan gets, right? There's one type of natural disaster like earthquakes, which nobody can control, and there's no responsibility on anyone there. And so states can do. But then there is clearly something that has a link with man-made, with human action. And that type of, climate-induced disaster needs to be apportioned. There needs to be attribution to states, and then they need to start taking action regardless. And Pakistan has been at the forefront. Senator Sharif Rahman, she did a fantastic job negotiating, a lot of the compensation-related background that needed to be there. But I think we're still a long way off from the type of commitments. And saying that we're going to pay this much is one thing, and actually, that money being in the hands of those affected by it, or leading to development in those countries to mitigate these programs, that is a completely different thing. And that's really something that we're still waiting on, unfortunately.
Absolutely. Like you mentioned as well, that there's a long way to go. But given the circumstances that we're living in now, climate change and laws, people that are being affected by climate change, it's often, compared to human rights cases as well. So do you think that does denying legal recognition to climate displaced people amount to human rights failure under international law?
Absolutely. Absolutely. I don't think there's any way that we can divorce climate change from human rights. And in the end, it isn't even something, it isn't a causation related logic here. The logic is, what is the result? Is a human, is an individual, are their rights being violated? Whether it is right to education, whether it is right to life, whether it is right to, anything to enjoy the rights that the Constitution or international law grants us, right? And the thing is that that certainly is the case. We're seeing climate change affect that. We're seeing it far worse for women than it is for men. We're seeing all of these elements taking place.
And children.
And children, of course. All vulnerable groups, right? So whether it's the elderly, whether it is disabled people with disabilities, when it's a factor that affects everyone, it affects them far worse. And that's just the nature of this vulnerability, really. There. And so what we're seeing is that no one's taking the responsibility with regards to wanting to help fix those rights. So it's not about who caused it. Forget that. It's about how can we mitigate the losses and how can we protect individuals from the rights that are being violated in that regard. And when a state has the ability, whether it is financial or things or elsewhere, then the responsibility is even more. Incapable states is a separate thing, right? A state has the government isn't functioning or the school system is terrible. That is a separate thing. But just denying it when you have the ability, that becomes highly problematic. And that's something that we're seeing where countries or governments at least are not taking responsibility for their own citizens and allowing some of these terrible violations really to take place, regardless of who actually caused them. Right?
Absolutely. What would you actually change on the ground if climate-induced migration were formally recognized as a legal category?
That's a a big question. What would I change on the ground? Well, first of all, I think there need to be even if we have a legally recognized category, there need to be processes in place whereby individuals can seek whether it is shelter in another country, whether it is shelter within their country, because the primary obligation will be the state in which the disaster took place, right? It's their obligation. It's only when that state can't will citizens flow out of their borders, right? And we see this in the most impoverished countries, the least developed countries. That's where, when disasters take place, you have this problem of people crossing the border and seeking safety elsewhere. So when that takes place, we have to see, the initial obligation is on the state for it to recognize it under domestic law, and then it's on the international community. And once that's recognized, you have processes which are somewhat at par with, say, refugee law. How you determine, well-founded persecution. Has an actual natural disaster taken place? Has and looking at an earthquake or a cyclone or something along which is clearly climate related, changing weather pattern, drought, famine, that's easy to determine. But some of the slower moving ones, right? Rains have stopped in a place and people have moved from that area. How do you determine that? So there need to be mechanisms and processes in place that can do that. And then there needs to be a study on how these individuals can integrate into the society that they settle in, what protections they actually need. And can they, for example, resettle in, say, another part of their own country, which is the most ideal solution because it doesn't cross the international threshold there. So with the legal recognition, I would also think that there needs to be also an understanding of how we can help these states develop their own capacities to deal with these individuals who are suffering from climate-induced issues.
Thank you so much for providing us with the extremely holistic solutions that a lot of countries can adopt and follow suit from. And I think collaboration is the key. Climate change is an issue that is an international issue. It has no visas, it has no borders, and everyone, is being impacted by it. So I think unless we all collaborate, may it be the state, may it be different countries, and other key collaborators like citizens, we all need to come together to come to a solution for this. And thank you so much, Oves, for your time and for your brilliant insights. Thank you.
Climate migration forces us to confront uncomfortable truths about inequality, responsibility, and justice. Those who contributed the least to climate change are paying the highest price, often without recognition, protection, or choice. Addressing climate migration isn't just about borders or policies. It's about whether the world is willing to take responsibility for the consequences of a warming planet. That's all for today's episode of Front Seat to Climate Change. My thanks to Maria Patel, Richter and Oves Anwar for sharing their insights. I'm Mahin Azam Khan. See you next time.